Hello, I'm Gary Stearman, and today on Prophecy in the News, we're going to address a subject that you may have seen in the news recently. It's all about Noah's Ark. We have a gentleman with us today who is an authority on Noah's Ark, and I'll be introducing him to you in just a moment. And welcome to today's Prophecy in the News. We have a guest. His name is Arch Bonema. He comes from McKinney, Texas, and he's been to the mountaintop. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. Welcome to Prophecy in the News, Arch.
Thank you, Gary. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. We're going to first ask you about the news item that's been all over the news, the world news actually. Noah's Ark discovered in Turkey on Mount Ararat. What do you think about that?
Interesting, isn't it?
It
is. Everybody says no one's interested in hearing about God anymore and the Bible anymore, and yet it made worldwide news.
Wow.
When they found it.
Good point.
Unfortunately for them, within 3 days it was proven to be a fraud, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I think what's interesting is that so many people continue to go to Mount Ararat in Turkey, because the Bible is very clear on where Noah's Ark is, and Turkey doesn't fit that model at all.
Mount Ararat, Turkey, we've had astronauts climbing Mount Ararat. We've had satellite photos. The world's attention's been focused on that particular mountain, which, by the way, stands all by itself. It's just, there it is, right out in the middle of a plain, right?
It's interesting because Genesis 8 verse 4 says, as the waters receded, the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. And it's true. If you look on a globe or a map, it shows Mount Ararat in Turkey. What it doesn't show is it wasn't named Mount Ararat until 4,000 years after the flood. And if you go to Wikipedia, in the 11th century, the Armenians started calling it Noah's Mountain. Then in the 13th century, Marco Polo was traveling across Turkey on the way to China. When they said, this is Noah's Mountain, and Noah's Ark is on this mountain, he said, well, then that must be Mount Ararat, and wrote Ararat in his book and on the map, and that was the first time that was called Mount Ararat.
So by extension, they came up with the name of the mountain. This is Noah's Mountain, therefore it must be Mount Ararat.
That's right.
Backwards logic.
But the interesting thing, the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says it landed in the mountains of Ararat, but doesn't say Turkey. The first two clues that we have a problem is it says mountains, plural. And except for Mount Ararat with little Ararat being right alongside of it, that's the only thing that there is for mountains out there. And the next verse is even more specific. As the waters continued to recede, the tops of other mountains all came into view. You know, we used to have military bases there, and I've had pilots email me, write me, call me, saying, you know, we flew around Mount Ararat, and you couldn't see anything for hundreds of miles. I flew across it at 38,000 feet, and the pilot said, look out the right side of the plane, you'll see Mount Ararat. And sure enough, but as far as you could see at 38,000 feet, there were no other mountains that could be seen. So
what you're saying is the recent claim that's being made is false.
But it goes back a long time. In 1616, Sir Walter Scott wrote in 1616 that it was impossible for it to be in Turkey because of Genesis 11 verse 2. 11 verse 2, it says, as Noah's sons came off the mountain, they traveled from the east to Shinar. Well, if you're traveling from the east, you're headed west. Now here's the problem, is Mount Ararat in Turkey is northwest. So if you're already west, you come off the mountain and travel west, how far do you have to go before you're east?
Yeah, a long, long way.
That's correct. So when the NIV was written, someone looked at the map and said, uh-oh, the Bible was written wrong. They corrected the Bible, so they said Noah's sons traveled eastward instead of from the east.
Yes.
The problem is the Greek says apo, apo, from the east.
Yes.
The King James says from the east. The Hebrew says from the east, but the NIV changed it. What was interesting, in 2008, after me giving this talk many times, I got a Bible in the mail from the NIV saying, please don't say that we're saying it more, we've changed the Bible. So from 2008 forward, the NIV now says, Noah's sons traveled from the east.
And from the east they did travel. Now, if you go from the traditional site, Mount Ararat, and get to a site that you're interested in, you have to go toward the east.
If we do, yes, if we do just the opposite, if we go to Shinar and go to the east, you find the range of mountains that for more than 2,000 years was called the region of Ararat. And there's a mountain there that there are 4 maps from 900 AD all the way back to 600 BC that show one mountain that has Noah's Ark on it. From different explorers over a 1,700-year time span, 4 explorers claim to have found Noah's Ark. And that mountain is Mount Soliman, the only mountain in the entire Middle East with a Hebrew name.
Solomon. How
That's
about
what it
that?
is.
Yeah.
Mount Soliman.
All right, now we get to the interesting part of the story. Arch Bonema has actually traveled to the quote-unquote mountains of Ararat mentioned in the Bible. This is what you believe you've done. And you have actually climbed one of those mountains. Tell us how that happened, how you came to climb that particular mountain, and what you saw.
Well, there's a group of 14 of us that went back there in June of 2006, just a few years ago. And as we climbed the mountain, when we got to the base camp, our Sherpas, our mountain guides, there was 5 of them. The grandfather in his 70s, his 2 sons in their 40s, and 2 grandsons in the 20s. When the grandfather approached us, he said, "Why are you at my mountain? You're the only second white people I've ever seen. The first ones were Germans 35 years ago."
Wow.
Well, our comment was, before we left, it looked like the war between Israel and Iran was breaking out, so we weren't going to be talking about Noah's Ark. So we just said, we're looking for an object. He lit up, he says, "You want to see Noah's Ark?"
Yeah.
We said, "Well, okay, why do you ask?" "Because it's on my mountain." He said, "I haven't seen it for more than 50 years. But each year now, the ice, it keeps melting up. Global warming." And he says, "This is the first time we can see it in more than 50 years. And that, of course, extraordinarily raised our anticipation and adrenaline level.
And so you began the trek, and you got there, and to make a long story, and it's, by the way, could be a very long story, to make a long story short, what did you see as you came upon this scene, which he claimed to be the scene of Noah's Ark?
At 13,126 feet, we found the petrified remains of an ancient ship.
Okay.
We took more than 1,000 pictures. As a group, we took more than 1,000 pictures. We brought back 16 pieces of it. We sent 5 of the pieces to 5 different labs. All the labs came back with the same answer. They said you have the petrified remains of an ancient ship, based on 3 things. First of all, it was petrified wood. Secondly, 2 of the pieces had saltwater creatures that had burrowed deep into the wood and became petrified with it. And finally, some of the pieces were soaked with pitch. The only reason to soak wood with pitch is to make a ship. Now the question is, which ship is it?
Yes.
We looked all over for a plaque that said SS Noah, but there wasn't any. The scientists, however, gave us 3 options. It's interesting because they knew we had a ship, but how could you get a ship at 13,000 feet? The interesting thing is they came up with 3 options, and of course they were right up front. They weren't Christians, didn't believe the story of Noah's flood, didn't believe the Bible, but they said, let's just say one option is this Noah's Ark. The second option is there are more than 70 world religions that have the story of a worldwide flood with someone saving them from it. So it could be a different ship, different religion, different time. But actually the most probable thing was that the ship probably got beamed up there by space aliens. Maybe the ones who built the pyramids.
Oh,
And
very
that's the options that they gave us.
modern mythology. Well, Arch, you've brought some samples, and I'm holding one here, which is a barnacle. Now, everybody's heard of barnacles. They are the plague of the U.S. Navy because they attach themselves to the outside of a ship's hull, and they grow a shell, and eventually you can become so barnacle encrusted that your ship begins to lose speed because of the drag. And it takes a while for a barnacle to attach itself and grow there. And when you found this petrified, whatever it is up there, it had saltwater barnacles attached to it.
It was interesting because there's a big article in Iran's national newspaper, the Persian Times, within 2 weeks after we got back, claiming these people, these Texans, which I was because that's where our president was from, was and still am, these Texans claimed to have found a ship on a mountain. Now at that time we never claimed how big it was, we just showed small pieces. They said, we looked at their small pieces on the internet, and if that really turns out to be wood, it's probably the remains of a sheep herder's cabin.